Well, thank you very much. Thanks to the Asia Society for having me here on the stage with Dr. Woetzel. Thank you for coming here, and thank all of you for showing up. I will be the moderator tonight. I am sitting next to somebody with so much brain power, experience, and information that he must be moderated. And that is my role, to just keep the governor from going up too high. So we'll start with some questions that I have, and we will end with some questions that you have. I'll try to leave 15 or 20 minutes at the end, and we'll open it up to the audience. We have some microphones that'll be going around, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion and get a pretty good overview of the voluminous information that you have put out in various reports, several books, and then, of course, in your consulting practice. Wow, the digital revolution in China. I don't even know where we are with the digital revolution here in Houston, Texas, or the United States, or in the world in general. I'm wondering if you could just sort of paint a picture of where all this is. I still have the iPhone 6. I haven't gotten to the 10 yet. Yeah. But where is the world in terms of this transition? And in particular, where's China in comparison to the United States and the rest of the world?
Right. Well, thank you, and thanks to the Asia Society, and very glad to have this chance to talk a bit about our collective work at MGI. I guess the one sentence answer is we're all very early days on this, and I think it's the Solow Paradox redux, as the economists would say. Like back in the day, they would say we'd see the computers everywhere, but except in the productivity numbers. And then sometime along in the 2000s, all of a sudden you start to see the impacts and all of this outsourcing and globalization that was essentially an after effect of all the computers. We're going into this digital age now, and we're just scratching the surface of what's coming up next. And so as we look at most value chains, whether it's retail or manufacturing or utilities, less than 15 or 20% of the potential has been realized so far. When we think about business processes becoming digital, transactions going online, people basically being digitally enabled in their daily work, it's still much more the exception than the rule, and that's equally true for U.S. and China. Now, U.S. is, if you just take a quantum and we have a digital index and we sort of look at things like in assets, usage, people, we said, yeah, the U.S. is definitely more digitized than China. And, but the reality, what we see is China's catching up really fast. Like 5 years ago, I think, or no, actually 3 years ago, 2013, according to our digital index, the U.S. was maybe 4.9 or 5 times as digital as China. 2016, 3 years later, China's closed that gap by about 25%. So it's now about 3.7 times. So that's reasonable given that China, again, is this vast country with over 100 years of economic history going on at the same time. And so you've got some places like Shanghai, which are really modern, but you've also got some places like Guizhou, which are really not. And so yeah, big catch up going on. And still so much more to come. I think that's what we would expect is to see really huge transformations in almost every sector that you can think of.
Tell us a little bit about what we hear, the bat companies. You see this on the headlines if you have Fox Business News or CNBC on in the background. But tell us what these companies are and give us just a rough idea of what they do.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something, again, a bit of a Chinese, I won't say unique, but it's certainly one of the distinguishing characteristics. And BAT is Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. Baidu is search, Alibaba is commerce, Tencent is communications and gaming. These companies, though, they are now super apps in a sense. Like if you go on your WeChat which is Tencent, is the only application which really competes with Apple in sort of having its own ecosystem. So if you use your WeChat, you use it for communication, like your messenger, but you also use it for payment, you use it for gaming, you use it for ordering a taxi, you use it for food delivery, and use it for the one button I haven't yet used is women's style. I understand it's there, but it's so yeah. There's 90 plus apps on this thing that's in this WeChat ecosystem. So that is sort of a representative of the way these guys operate, in that they actually are accounting for almost 40% directly of venture capital in the internet space in China. And so these guys have a piece of almost everybody.
So these are their Apple, their Amazon, and their Google or their Facebook,
except a bit bigger, and a little bit more aggressive in that their alumni tend to populate the companies, every other company.
So China's got a bigger population than we have, right? And they have a larger middle class at this point, I think. The definition varies in terms of the cutoff, but I mean in terms of just quantity of people who buy middle class stuff, whether it's cars or apartments or take trips, then yeah, sure. By that definition, I think that's fair. And certainly they'll have more people moving into the middle class, so there'll be more people using these services as time goes on. There's nothing but a growth curve ahead. Paint a picture of some of the smaller success stories. I think your research showed, a little over a third of the so-called unicorn companies. These are companies that are worth about $1 billion, are privately held. And they call them unicorns.
It's just fascinating stuff. Again, over a third of the unicorns are Chinese right now globally, which is so when you talk to people who are in the technology research business, they sort of say, this is the thing they don't get. So how does a low middle income country wind up with a third of the world's unicorns? I mean, this is a country still with a GDP per capita of somewhere around 12,000, I think, right now. So it's less than a fourth of the U.S., and yet it has all these technology companies. Where they come from? Well, again, you said market, huge market, and growing market. So great opportunity for growth in that. So who are these companies? Well, I mean, Mobike and Ofo are the two that most people would know because they're the share biking companies, and that's so they've solved last mile in China basically. So how do you get from your home to your bus stop or your subway stop? Well, you take a share bike, which is it's literally like a tool that you just sort of let out into the wilds of urban setting, and then you pick it up, you use it, and then you just drop it, and hopefully you drop it in a place which doesn't get in front of somebody.
We have those here
sidewalk.
in Houston, right? But they're not used for last mile. They're just used for decoration of street corners or something.
This is a very functional approach, but I mean, so that's one example. But there are plenty of others, and I think that one of the ones that we write about in my 1 Hour China book is the selfie company, the self-beautification company, which is that it's an app that's basically only there for the people to refine their selfies, so that you can use this program and it makes you look better. And so there was a funny story about a woman who got pulled over for drunken driving somewhere out in Xinjiang, and the police take a picture of you when you get pulled over, and she said, no, let me use my app. I'm going to make it look a little bit better. I don't want you to use that picture. So yeah, like that.
So are there some other examples that you can maybe tell us about? Of unicorns, like are there U.S. companies that can go in there and kind of tap these same
some are doing all right. I mean, Airbnb is doing fine. LinkedIn is doing fine. So some of the bigger U.S. companies have already, WeWork. I mean, I don't know what it's really.
So they let LinkedIn in there, but not so much Google or Facebook.
I think that's fair to say. I mean,
why couldn't LinkedIn be used for the same subversive purposes?
You'd have to talk to Reed about that. I think that. There has been more investment on his side, and that companies vary in their approach to government and what they're willing, how they're willing to work together.
So some people hire McKinsey and some people don't. Maybe that's
talk about clients.
So anyway, a couple more examples of small, when I say small, something that's reached $1 billion isn't small to me, but small companies that have been fairly successful in China, and maybe like what would their analogs be in the United States?
Well, I mean, some are difficult, like the drone people, DJI, which essentially comes out of, you could say, I guess the analog would be Qualcomm. I mean, so they were the manufacturers of drones for a long time. But, DJI takes that to the next level and make much more consumer focused. And, or I'm thinking of, on the accelerators. So you have HAX, which is again a Shenzhen accelerator, which would be like the Y Combinator of China, sort of the place to go and sort of become part of that network as a young person. So I mean, and medical is another area we see a lot. I think the medical system in China, because it is so heavily state influenced, though not state paid, which is interesting because the big hospitals are all state owned, but the individuals are paying the bills. It's like 50% self-pay. So you kind of have this real pressure cooker there of how from the government to say you got to keep up with the marketplace. So that's created an opportunity to introduce some interesting new AI technologies. I'm thinking about one company which has basically two products. One is for CAT scans and the other is for MRIs. And the CAT scan is essentially there to help doctors assess stroke victims that much faster. And so with this, you can cut the time of diagnostic from 35 seconds down to 3, because essentially it's going to read the scan, and it's going to instantly highlight where is the amount of the hemorrhage and give you a direct recommendation for how you should treat. And so this is, in the case of stroke, 30 seconds actually can make a real difference. And that's a product that I would actually expect to see in the U.S. pretty soon. So it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. So, in a few words, how did China get here so quickly? It seems like from 2000 until now I guess it's 2017 already. So it's not. I mean, some people got old during that period, like me. But how did they get to where they are so quickly?
Yeah, well,
especially when you think about the constraints between, sort of the government that they had, and then sort of their nod to free markets and capitalism at the same time. That maybe that worked out better than our freewheeling society where anyone can tweet anything they want anytime they want.
All
right. I was just talking about everyone, no one in particular.
Okay. So. First of all,
but wait, social media. Like WeChat, only 50 people, right?
In small groups. It's
and is that true of LinkedIn or other social networks? You can only have so many connections.
Yeah.
So you can't just blast out your thoughts to everyone.
Yeah, very difficult to do that. No, but that says everything goes viral in China very quickly. So 50 goes to 50.
Really?
To 50,
so that's how people market viral.
Yeah, I mean, it's not one person, but news spreads almost instantaneously across the network, and it's small groups at a time. So I don't know if it actually affects anything.
Well, but I was just thinking, if you had a small business there, how do you market it if you can't have more than many people to
that is where the analytics come in, because I think that's where China has one of those. So so how do these companies pick up? It's because first of all, you've got 750 million in users. And they're all online pretty much all the time. So you've got an amazing data pool. And so companies that can figure out how to get that data and use that data and analyze it to segment and and as a result become much more effective in their marketing, they grow quickly. And that's the marketing challenge that Western or foreign companies coming in have, because they're sort of used to a much more offline kind of approach, and they're thinking about I'm going to gather information on the street. And it's like, well, that's kind of almost irrelevant in the Chinese context. The street is sort of a way after effect of whatever happened online, which is 90% of the time. Basically nobody does an only offline journey anymore. So so you got to understand people, and you got to go out and gather those data through the WeChat, through the Taobao and the Tmall, and then you figure out what you're going to differentiate on. So that's the difference between the Chinese and the non-Chinese environment is the data intensity of it all, and these big platforms that give you access pretty much immediately to hundreds of millions of customers if you can figure that out.
So a little bit about the Chinese government's support of innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
What have they been doing to facilitate all this? And how are American companies, governments, and investors reacting? Because are they doing something better than us?
Well, I mean, I think that's the third link. I mean, it's sort of the third piece of this, story. Because the one piece we've already said a lot about is the market. So there's this huge middle class growth. I mean, 700 million people online. Second piece is the companies, and so BAT and their ecosystem and all the startups that go along with it. And the third piece is the government. And the government's attitude in general has been very pro-innovation. So as I say, innovation, generally speaking, good thing. And so from the Chinese government perspective, you could say, they've had relatively light regulation of innovation, or you could just say relatively late regulation. So it took them 11 years to decide that Alibaba was a bank. That more or less came about when the other banks started complaining about Alibaba, saying, you guys are taking my business and you don't actually have a license. And so we said, okay, fair enough. So now we license them. But generally, the government's approach to this has been to simply, rather than regulate the service, to regulate the problem. So when a problem comes in, then they solve the problem. But they don't necessarily go out and ask, have people sort of define a priori the solution. So, for example, surge pricing. They had a lot of consumer complaints about e-hailing and surge pricing in Shanghai. Government steps in and says, okay, so now we're going to solve this problem and make surge pricing go away, at least for a period of time over in particular geographies. So they had another problem about sort of basically taxi cab drivers complaining they were losing all their business to migrant workers who were then just literally driving in from the countryside to drive a Didi in Shanghai. And so the government basically came up with a policy which says it's fine to have Didi e-hailing, but only people who are resident of Shanghai can drive those cars. Which basically solved the problem. So their problem was an employment problem, but they still wanted to have the service being provided. So that's kind of been their approach all along, is to say, we want to have the innovation, and when there's a problem, we'll try to fix it and try to step in on it.
So besides regulation, are they subsidizing? Are they what kinds of things are they doing to support this?
Well, there's been some stupid money. I mean, there's been some government-funded accelerators and startups, and so this is clearly it's sort of a product of local government's excessive desire for create something out of nothing. So I had this hilarious.
Isn't that the dream? Something from nothing.
Something
Isn't that
from nothing.
The whole universe? And
well,
that's
maybe,
what we
but
want to emulate?
These guys, the difference in China is that the government, in the case of local government, owns the land. And so they can borrow against it.
I see.
And so they also have the bank, and they also have a lot of the construction. So you can go quite far down this track before you realize you've done a stupid thing. So I have one city, which will go nameless. Recently, I just sort of received the request. It's like, we want you to come up with a unicorn island. I was like, what is that? Is it like an LGBT island or something? It's like, no, we want an island for unicorns. And so it's like, well, that's not really the way it works.
Aren't unicorns supposed to be like mythological?
It's supposed to be something like a healthcare, or is that? No, we're very clear. We want billion-dollar companies. That's all we want. We want the billion-dollar companies here. So you figure out how. It's like, okay, step this back a little bit. So I admire your aspiration, but you probably should have a little bit more of a thought process behind it.
So how do you manage an expectation like that? That sounds like a tough order. Your company wants the business, right? But the business is kind of ridiculous.
The government is very aspirational in China. I mean, they have an expectation for delivery, and they can deliver, generally speaking, on what they have to do relatively on time, if not on budget. So roads get built, buildings get constructed, the water gets connected, and all the rest of it. But whether that's actually been leads to economic development is a function more of how business friendly their environment is. And so that part I think they appreciate, is that they are in competition with each other, and that's kind of how the whole country works. It's very competitive.
So the basic infrastructure of the internet, fiber optics, data centers, all those things.
Yeah.
is the government investing heavily in those things the way they are? And some of the things you read about, like entire cities where nobody ever lives.
Yeah. Well, yes, because, all of this infrastructure has been funded by ultimately it's been funded by the Chinese consumer. These people pay competitive, but certainly not bargain basement prices for electricity or telephone or internet service. So ultimately that, again, scale kind of gets you a long way down the road. The rest of it is sort of, again, is it efficient? No. China invests 35-40% of its GDP and gets 7% growth now or 6% growth now. India invests 25% of its GDP and gets 9 or 10% growth. So India much more efficient, but it's a smaller economy in different stages. So it's not a very efficient process, but it's quite effective.
We invest trillions and trillions of dollars and get less than 2% growth. So
yeah,
I think they're doing something right.
So yeah, but it's a competitive. Again, the essence of it all is very competitive. That everybody competes with everybody else in China, and at all pieces of the value chain. I used to say it takes 2 Chinese companies to make a price war, and eventually that's why you get to when does it stop? Well, when you get to 80% market share, which is currently what DiDi has in e-hailing.
So in your research, you go sector by sector, and you sort of talk about all of the revolutions that are going on in all those sectors. But talk a little bit about energy, healthcare, consumer, finance. Like which of these sectors are really getting the benefit of this the quickest and really growing the fastest? And what part of Chinese economy will this not affect?
Yeah. Well, a couple. This is so. I'll try to be concise, but there's a lot.
You don't have to be concise with this one because there are a lot of sectors.
Yeah, because
Well, and they're paying attention. Look, they're all watching you. They're not playing with their technology. You've got the audience.
But at the edge, and this is true in every economy, though, the ones that are leading edge are the technology-intensive industries. So it's your ICT, your media, your finance. These are people who basically their business is technology, and so how do they use technology? So they're the early adopter and the more technologically inclined. Then you've got sort of a bunch of guys in the middle, and I've sort of divided into 3 categories. The first one in China is consumer and retail, sort of consumer-facing, whether it's entertainment and recreation or it's retail, it's supermarkets. You got a lot of usage coming up now. Still, again, we're very early days, so but still, China is 40% of world's e-commerce, and it's just a staggering number. And you got huge investments going in, so that's begun driven by that middle class. The second bucket is government, anything related to government. And government has been doing a lot of investments in assets. And so this is the state grid, this is the utilities, this is the education system, it's the healthcare system. Again, all these things are basically owned. The core of the system is owned by government. And so government's spending a lot of money on it. Usage, not quite yet there. So a lot of the education is, it's like, they have the computer, are they really using it? Not sure. So that's the second bucket. And then the third one is all the capital intensive stuff, like the steel and the chemicals. And these are, relatively speaking, a few number of companies. They're not they're not hundreds of thousands. We're talking about hundreds maybe, but they're new. They're new companies, and they've all basically been set up in the last 20 years. So you find the best steel plants, and you find the best chemical plants, and so they're digital. So those different stages of development, but those are the ones who are going online now. And then finally, you've got all the rest, which will be the construction, the personal services, really fragmented local agriculture. Those guys are like, okay, at some point they'll get there. So that's kind of the big picture on sectors. Now, within any sector, though, you're going to find sort of really interesting sort of highlights and sort of companies that are trying to break the mold. And so the big topic in China these days is retail. And that's what Alibaba will call the new retail. Because Ali got picked on a lot, basically, for saying, are you trying to bankrupt the retail industry? Every time you open a store, a department store closes. Every time you boost your sales by 5%, a bunch of department stores go bankrupt. So how socially good are you? So they've come up with a new approach, which is essentially to enable all the small retailers of China. And so they said, bring everybody online. We'll be the cloud services guys for all you guys. So basically, they've got a model for a supermarket which has 50% online sales. So 50% of the sales in the supermarket are coming by people ordering online. Then it gets picked up in the supermarket and gets delivered back to that person. And they have a 3-kilometer radius around the store, 30-minute delivery time. The stores themselves are not Ali stores. They're small businesses. And so Ali's basically the landlord on this, but he's enabling it through the digital. And because they're capturing a lot of information on these people, they can basically say, well, this kind of seafood is going to be better than that kind of seafood this time of year, so we have a different kind of seafood selection, all of which adds up to a lot more sales. So any retailer wants to be part of this because essentially it does all your work for you. It sort of identifies your customer, helps you get delivery to the customer, helps you figure out your own assortment. They say sales per square meter 3 to 5 times what you would find in a traditional supermarket. So I mean, maybe they're somewhat selective in their choices here, but it's certainly going to get some kind of an advantage. So I think what we start to see is sort of like that's the face of retail. It's not to get rid of the retailers, to make the retailer better. There's a better retail experience and assortment and selection and delivery and all, and customer relationships. So that's kind of, I think, a kind of cool story.
So do you think, you mentioned like the social good, but do you think like China puts more emphasis on what's good socially than the United States? I think we put a lot of stuff out there that isn't really all that great, you know. You could argue that it's got a negative effect on society, but are they more conscious of that? Or,
there was an old joke.
Is it just like whatever makes money? That's what the social good is.
Well, I think there's plenty of problems with China, with the way China does business, and people in China are as commercial or entrepreneurial as they are in anyone. But
you know what I see, like if somebody gets caught like a CEO for swindling a company, sometimes they're executed. Like they take that pretty seriously.
Yeah,
we let them go. We let them start another company.
I've not seen that in the U.S. recently. So no, that's state enterprise corruption, and I think that's that's what she is on about. It's the anti-corruption drive. It's just a very clear sort of new normal for the conduct of business, particularly by government officials, though I don't think exclusively at all. But this is society in transition. There's a joke that people in Beijing would just say, if we're so lucky in Beijing, we open the window and we get a free cigarette, and then the Shanghai guy says, no, for us we just turn on the tap water and we get pork chop soup. And the pigs are floating.
Okay, so they're not so good on environmental regulations.
Environmental it's getting better now, and so I think that this is certainly a place where you got to be wary of. And so we actually talk to Chinese consumers, and you say, "What are you worried about? What's good food?" And they'll say McDonald's.
Well, we used to say that.
Yeah, I know. And you say, why? And he says, because it's safe. And he said, what do you mean it's safe? It's going to give you, a heart attack at the age 45. But no. I mean, as in, it's safe. As in, I know that there isn't, something horrible inside it. There's no foxtails, or, there's some. It's literally the physical environment is actually still the concern for most people in China, and in that kind of example. So, the concerns are maybe a little different, but they are, they're evolving.
So, how do you bring some of this back to Houston? We're talking about something that seems a little abstract, but the world's connected, right? And Houston companies have many ties to China.
Yeah.
Bring this back to Houston. How is the digital revolution in China creating opportunities or challenges for us here? Thinking about the energy sector and maybe the healthcare sector.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of opportunities, and I used to say, if you don't go to China, China will come to you, and I think we start to see that, across North America, in the U.S. particularly. China's capital exporter, and Chinese tourism, and Chinese real estate investment. I think those effects, I think everybody sees, and we're going to see more of. We sort of, from a business standpoint, as you say, this is a kind of a global deal. I mean, global technology is almost by its nature a global conversation. Now, how that happens is that some companies doing better than others, and some regulatory barriers being in place from both sides. That is something I think we can talk about it nationally, but we also have a huge opportunity locally. So the most recent trip you were just mentioning, I think, creates a good opportunity like healthcare. So 10 years ago or 15 years ago, people in China was saying sort of didn't really know who the right institution to work with in the U.S. would have been, and sort of which hospital is better than which, and who are the key researchers, and sort of and how to get clued in. And what I heard from that was they got that one really now. They got that one really clear, very very clear on which are the right places to go and who we should be talking to from a Chinese side. And I think that Houston companies should be the same about China. They should figure out who are going to be the top 5 Chinese researchers, Chinese medical institutions, Chinese regulators, and be as comfortable talking to them as they are talking to any of their other colleagues anywhere in North America. And so it's just one big global playing field, and the U.S. and China are basically the only game in town. And it's for 80% of technology, and so for any U.S. company, they should just sort of get that idea is that this has got to be the same conversation. And as you talk to the Chinese entrepreneurs, you'll see these are typically people who have already spent 5-10 years in the U.S. They've done postdoc work here. They have Sequoia Capital and Benchmark Fund as their anchor investors. So I mean, they're doing it. So you say, why isn't Houston companies doing it too? You should get the Chinese equivalents all on board. So that's the opportunity, I think, on the tech side. And then beyond that, just one or two quick things. As I said, Houston's a manufacturing city, so you've got a lot of manufacturing here. China's a manufacturing country, so you have this great sort of collaboration or competition. But either way, there should be a conversation going on about how to use the tech that's coming up in Industry 4.0 in China and how to use that here. I heard that that China was talking about having a fully automated port. No people. So I mean, that's coming. So that's going to be a testing ground for technology. It's going to be a place where you're going to find new ways of using tech to drive logistics. And so I would think, again, Houston as a big logistics center would want to be part of that. We want to understand how that tech's developing and figure out what could it do as being the leader in logistics technology in the United States. So this is a great opportunity perhaps for collaboration. So.
Well, we're going to put all the people at the port out of a job. We're going to put all the drivers of buses and trucks and cars out of a job.
Yeah.
Right? AI is going to control everything. That's going to be a problem here. But does China have any sort of strategy for dealing with what some have called the future leisure society, where nobody has a job, only...
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
how do they think about that problem? I know how we think about it, which is not very... Not carefully.
Well, I think, first of all, China kind of takes the point of view that it's not a labor-rich society. It already is. The workforce in China's peaked. It's done. They're
not?
No.
They have cheaper labor costs, cheaper production costs. We can barely compete with them.
Wages go up 15% a year.
Really?
Every year. That's because there are no more new workers. Workers are done. I mean, there's still transition from agricultural to urban, but there are no more people.
Isn't that still a big transition?
It is. That's why you have this. That's why the wages are low. I mean, if that wasn't happening, you're going to see things skyrocket, and you already do that. You see in places, local markets get out of line, and all of a sudden. So if you go around this kind of table in Shenzhen, you have people say their name. Give me your number. Your number is like 4, 6, 8. What's that number? That's the number of weeks it takes to turn over 100% of the factory workers. 100% of the factory workers turn over, within a matter of weeks. That's kind of an expression of wage acceleration. So the basic philosophy is that we're not going to have any more people. So if we're going to grow the economy, every person has to become more productive. So anything that helps every person become more productive is a good thing. And that is therefore AI and machine learning and robots and all the dark factories and all the rest of it. And, so is there going to be enough demand? And they sort of say, yeah, we got that one. We got that. That's the middle class income growth. There's going to be demand. Don't worry. We'll find out something for everybody to do. But if we're going to get rich, we got to get more productive. And they're starting from a much lower level, of course. So that's why it's difficult to compare. But the basic philosophy is that, we don't have we don't have they don't have an option here. It's like, they're getting old before they get rich, so let's get rich faster. I think that's the idea. So what to do about it all? I think the main thing is the Chinese would say to the U.S., and I had a Chinese client one time tell this to a bunch of U.S. clients who said, well, how do I learn from China? And the Chinese looked at him and said, keep your costs low. You want to do what we do, keep your costs down, because that enables us to do what we do. It's like then we can save our money and we can reinvest it and we can grow faster and become more productive.
So I still think labor and production costs are cheaper there, and I think they're going to improve. I mean, their productivity is going to improve. So how can U.S. companies and investors compete with China?
Well, I think...
Given that it is still cheaper there, and of course there'll be other cheaper places than China.
Absolutely right. I mean, if it was all about cheap, we'd go to Bangladesh. And, some people do go take pieces of the value chain over to wherever it's cheapest because that's what you need. You see, and there's no real way to differentiate. So, which goes to the point is like, how to differentiate. And so every place has got its strengths, which is why we shouldn't compare because we lose the best of both. But there's going to be an opportunity here to leverage the U.S. market, which has been the source of the rebound in manufacturing growth, is this rebound in the U.S. consumer. So I mean, there's the depth of market knowledge and the accessibility of the market. I mean, these things can't be replicated from outside the country. And of course, the technological and innovative strengths of the country. So I don't think that there's anything that says there's a predetermined outcome here. In any given technology. What I think China has shown is that you can make progress really fast. And that I think is a salutary lesson. I think that's something that people shouldn't assume the way things are, the way things are going to be. And that's as true for the U.S. as it is for China.
Well, that's what we do here. We assume things are always going to be that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, and that the U.S. is the predominant economic superpower. China's surpassed Japan in terms of the size of its economy. That was not surprising, but it's one of those things you hear is going to happen, and then when it happens, you go, oh my God. How long will it be before China's economy surpasses ours? And at what point, we're not going to be able to keep printing money forever if we don't have the reserve currency. That seems to be the number one U.S. export is the dollar. When does China take over the whole world? I've heard 2050. I think you have some earlier predictions.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those parlor games where you can decide, but what does the number really mean? And so I think if you take the IMF or whoever's, exchange rate forecast, then it looks like 2040, 2050. If you take PPP, it looks like it may already have happened, but in 2025, 2030. But I mean, again, all of this is China would say, well, we're 1.3 billion people, right? And the average income per capita is still a quarter of that of the U.S. So we sure aggregate, but what does that really mean? Are we, and by any measure, the digitization, the consumption, the technological base of the U.S. versus China is still a huge gap. So that's and catching up. But so. I think that we shouldn't be overly, business people are optimists because, doesn't seem to be much point in being anything else. I mean, that optimists are the ones who sort of imagine the future and go for it. And I think that's the American character. And so the Chinese presence is we think, an opportunity. Let's go invest there.
Well, we could always be like Switzerland, right? We could just, have nice lives, but we won't dominate the whole world. That could be our future. I don't know. I don't find it particularly frightening, but empires don't last forever, and certainly before World War II, it might have been the British Empire, right? They ran
there is that narrative about this is to the the transition that went from World War I. Actually, it was that beginning of World War I, the U.S. owed Europe $3 billion or something of those dollars, and by the end of World War I, Europe owed the U.S. about $8 billion. So there was a big flip, and so are we there now? And I said, well, I don't know. That's a really interesting macro macro question. I think that, but you wouldn't blame U.S. for that. That was a European war.
Right.
They sort of did that, so at the same token, I mean, we should figure out our problems and sort them. But in an interconnected world, this is an opportunity. I mean, let's take advantage of the growth of the Chinese middle class, which is going to be there. Basically, two sources of consumer income growth in the next 30 years. One is OECD people retired over the age of 65, and the other is working Chinese people between the ages of 25 and 55. Each one of them amount for about 19 or 20% of global consumption growth. And so those are the two big pieces of discretionary income. And if you go, again, you say China, you sort of say, what do you guys want? And they say, well, we want what you have. We want, the same standard of living we want. And if you go to, there's a reason why Asian Americans are suing Harvard for quotas on entry. It's because they say, we have unlimited demand for your product, your service. It's like, stop quotaing us. And if you could build 5 Harvards, we'd fill them up too. Or, and 17 University of Houstons. It's certainly, so there's huge demand over there, and that's actually global demand. So I think that's kind of the great entrepreneurial opportunity to engage here. And on the technology side, I graduated from the University of Southern California in 1985, and I knew that at that point you could count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of non-Chinese graduates in the Department of Electrical Engineering. So you sort of knew that all of the engineering talent was going to be Chinese. And the only question was, where would they work? And they'd be working in the U.S. or in China for Chinese companies or U.S. companies. So I mean, this is again an opportunity to create the technological base by capturing this huge explosion of talent. I mean, talent. I mean, is something that is supposed to be equally distributed on the planet, but obviously it is, making it happen is something that only happens in a few places. And China has started to create this thing, so it's a huge opportunity for whoever gets it.
So, is China our friend or is China our enemy? We see, we see this in politics, right? In the last election there was a lot of play on China's taking us over, and we have unfair trade deals with China, and they cheat on currency exchanges, and they steal all of our intellectual property, right? These are the complaints about China. Yeah. But we buy all their stuff, right? And we sell them our bonds, and we're pretty happy to, do business over there. It's a very complicated relationship. I don't think that the average person understands the tension, but are we competitors, or are we cooperating with them and they're cooperating with us? Are we one big happy global market? How do you parse all that? Or is it just all political rhetoric, and the reality is money just goes where money goes?
I'll stay tuned for next year's China and the World report, but which I won't, which we are doing, I think that there is, certainly some truth in the idea that China has come onto this global scene much faster than anybody expected, including China. This was really not kind of where their head was at, a few years ago. So, and now they're there. And so with that, I think there's a new set of certainly a new level of importance to the conversation. And maybe a new principle, which simply put would be reciprocity. That you do unto me, I do unto you, and we work together. And that's actually a pretty good principle, because game theory would tell you, as long as you have reciprocity, eventually you'll get to a better outcome. So people will start behaving more reasonably towards each other. Right. If there's no conversation, if there's no dialogue, then there's not going to be any reciprocity, and there's not going to be any progress either. So I think we are in a new phase. I mean, clearly that we're moving into this bilateral, and I'm not sure bipolar is kind of got the wrong adjective, but this is the
probably close, right?
Yeah. The duopoly, or it's not a duopoly that gets the Europeans upset. So there's clearly 2 centers of gravity here in technology and in finance and consumer marketing, and so all of this kind of creates almost a requirement, I think, for a better conversation and a better dialogue. And I really believe that there can be that. The reality is there's nothing else that ties the United States and China together other than commerce. This is not UK and China and the US. This is not even Germany and the US. So that the entire cultural history of China and the U.S. is Qingdao beer and a bunch of railway workers, and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is not something we should be celebrating. So, so given that, the only way this is going to work is if we keep doing business with each other and we have a good set of mutually winning, beneficial, in the Chinese phrase, transactions. And step by step, we kind of create this sort of consensus or capacity, I would say consensus, for things that work for both societies. Otherwise, I would be expecting it would be a pretty bumpy road.
Well, money breaks down all kinds of barriers, I've noticed. People behave nicely towards each other when there's a transaction to be worked out between them. I would love to open this discussion up to anyone in the audience. We have a couple of microphones around here. Why don't we start with this gentleman here? And then we have a microphone on this side. Gentleman here who would like the next question.
Hi. My name's Rob. Recently, Tim Cook mentioned that he will never pull iPhone production out of China because of the depth and breadth of tooling engineers that he has in China that simply don't exist anywhere else in the world. Have you found anything on China's digital side that exists in a very unique and strong way that's driving some of their growth?
Well, I think first of all, the integration of manufacturing and software or online capacity is something that China's quite unique at. So again, the depth of the manufacturing. So that's why the drone guys are going to be kind of coming out of China. So it's just there's more of it. Now it's not everything, obviously. For example, Tesla, is a pretty good manufacturer. I think they're going to be parts of this manufacturing ecosystem which still aren't going to be Chinese preserved. And China doesn't have world-class semiconductor design. China doesn't have much of a software industry, certainly. So there's lots of work to be done, but the manufacturing is unique, again, because of the cost of the labor, which, as you correctly point out, is lower. Bio actually becomes very interesting because you get literally the capacity to do really large-scale testing. Not just the patient population, but the doctors and the researchers. You can run the machines, 365, 24/7, and presumably accelerate the discovery process. And so we see, a lot of biosimilars coming out of China now, which is essentially this very boil the ocean kind of approach to drug discovery. But when you have the resources and the cost structure, you could do that. So I think those are some of the characteristics of Chinese. The last thing is, again, government. Government is a big purchaser of technology. So, no other country has a strong smart grid. No other country has a high-speed rail the way that China does. So, this is all China basically saying, I'm going to spend the money. And it's sort of the equivalent of NASA. So the same kind of scale of program. And so it's just doing it with the technology they have today for the same basic purpose.
So another question right here, and if anyone wants to raise their hand for the next microphone.
Very nice presentation. So my question to you is, U.S. is a service-dominant country, and when China opened the door to the Western world in the early 1980s, China was a manufacturing-dominant country. But what's happening now, fundamentally in China now, is China is shifting the gear from a manufacturing-dominant country to service-dominant country. And my question to you, if China in the next few years become service dominant, that is exactly the reason why the labor cost in China is keep rising. And so when the China becomes a service dominant country, and what do you think about the landscape between the US and China and the competition landscape?
Well, that's the whole goal of China. The whole idea is to have labor costs go up. It's called salaries. And it proves that it works. So the average Chinese person makes more money. So that's kind of the objective. And we all know what a modern economy looks like. It's services, it's consumer, it's productivity, it's urban. And today China is basically none of that. it's not quite there. It's still 52% only urbanized. It's still got industrial weighting versus services, and it's still more investment than sort of balanced investment consumption, but it's still way low on consumption as a share. So all of this is just saying, hey, it's a work in progress, and that's why it's kind of you should expect that over time. Yeah, the U.S. and China will start to look quite similar in their economic drivers. And I actually think if you look at some of the problems in the U.S. and China, you'll see very big similarities, notably housing. I mean, there's a housing spiral in China just like there's a housing spiral in the U.S. And there's an affordable housing problem in China just like there's anybody been watching what's been going on in Beijing migrants in the last week or so. You can sort of see how that plays out, and it's not healthy. So clearly, there's actually quite a lot for city officials to have conversations about, saying how are we going to, address the basic problems of our new urbanized society. And so congestion, traffic.
Do we have another question? Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
I was wondering, what do you think that the new, I guess you would say, monitoring of social media and the population in general, what effect will that have on innovation, especially digital innovation?
I love that question, by the way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, first of all, a couple of thoughts on this. I mean, and one is the very anecdotal version is like, oh, Chinese people are okay with that. It's like fine.
It's like we're okay with the TSA searching our bags, right? Patting
You
us
get
down.
used to it. But I think there's something to that in the sense there wasn't a lot of monetary value or any other value associated with privacy or individual data in the history of China. So like it wasn't. So it was been a learned process to saying, oh, this has information value, and maybe I shouldn't just give it to you. So that I think is going to change over time. I think people are going to start sort of saying, hey, I don't feel like being part of your randomized survey without having my consent, or I give you privacy rights, and privacy software will become big, and we'll see. Right now, the government then, of course, is going into this whole thing about credit scoring. And you say social credit. Well, that's not really credit that they're talking about. They're talking about surveillance. So it's like, yeah, what did you pay for? But who did you talk to? And where did you go? And what did your friend do? It's like all that kind of be wrapped into that score there. And then everybody will get one big score. It's like, and then if I love the prizes. The prizes, if you have a really high score, you can go to Singapore without a passport. It's like, where else would you expect them to go? Yeah, I mean, reality is very few people in China have a credit score right now. And so the FICO system doesn't exist. And so there's part of this which is saying, oh, there's a real problem with fake. In China, you say, here we do fake whatever, but there it's fake, everything. It's like, so the whole, huge issues of counterfeit, of transaction fraud. Trust me, I have personal experience. So, so that's part of it. But the other part, of course, government says, I want to control everything. And I think a lot of people in China, I would just say, they have basically the idea that, hey, we're making a deal here. I'm giving you a lot of access, and besides, I don't think I can really say I can't do anything to stop it. But on the other hand, I expect you to make my life better. I expect you to increase my income every year, and that's the deal. Because we could always go back to the way things were, which we had all the surveillance and we just didn't have anything.
So on the subject of privacy, you had a very interesting story about how they solved the toilet paper problem.
Let's do that. Okay, so here's a Chinese story. Yeah. So, and I think some people know this Temple of Heaven is a big tourist attraction in Beijing, and so you have literally. Tourist attractions in Beijing typically get hundreds of thousands of people on a busy day, or maybe 1 million or so. And yeah, they got to go to the bathroom. But what was happening is that people were going into the toilet, into the bathroom, and they were literally taking the whole roll. And so they were just, the whole thing would disappear, and the staff were getting very upset. Because they have to keep running back and refilling the toilet paper, and there were problems and so forth. So they put in a facial recognition system. So it's basically you walk into the toilet paper dispenser and they look at that and take a picture, and it gives you 10 sheets of toilet paper. And so it comes out, and they say, well, that's nothing so novel. So, well, no, here's the trick: is you go back, if you go back with anything less than 5 minutes and you put your picture in the mirror, say, no more toilet paper for you. So using facial recognition technology to solve a problem for mass consumption. And so this was actually kind of a very classic kind of, I think, application use case for AI, because it's AI. I mean, this is actually, they're sort of going through their big database of all the pictures that have ever possibly been taken through this thing and saying, and that's you. And I saw you less than 5 minutes ago. I said, no.
We solved this problem in the 1950s with gas station toilet paper dispensers that don't exactly turn.
Yeah,
that was probably
mechanical.
the easier way to do it. That was low tech. This sounds like a lot more fun. So we have another question here.
Yeah, last week Jeremy Haft was in Houston. He spoke to the World Affairs Council twice about his new book, and he was saying that he thought that Chinese economic growth was going to stagnate just because of shortages coming up of basic needs like clean drinking water, arable land, and food. He said that's probably why it motivated why they purchased Smithfield. I was curious about your thoughts on that.
That would be a lot of pigs. No, I mean, I don't. We've never lost a water molecule. They're all out there. A friend of mine used to say,
You sure they didn't go into space when the asteroid hit?
Pretty sure they're there. Water flows uphill to money. And so this is creating a huge investment opportunity. And that's what happened. And China spends 9% of its GDP on what we call economic infrastructure. And water is actually a fairly substantial number in that. It's like 1 or 2% of GDP. It's a very big number. My short version of this is that I think that China is going to lead the world in resource productivity, and whether it's energy efficiency or water efficiency, and that this is all being turned into an industry for export. China's energy plant again, like it's steel plants, and I used to have friends who do Australian clean tech, and they just went straight to Baosteel, and they showed them what they could do, and then Baosteel said, "Great, I'll buy you." And so they're sort of going to take that that energy efficiency technology and use it to increase their own competitive advantage. I'm sure that the resource, again, China doesn't think of itself as a resource-rich country, doesn't think of itself it's a processing economy, and it is concerned about shortages. I think it is, and they've learned from the previous, mineral resource boom period that, they can get out of line. And so food does play into that, but generally speaking, I think they're actually pretty specific issues like palm oil and 1 or 2 other imported commodities that they have a particular concern on. But otherwise, their basic approach is that we should be more efficient. We should just use less, and they tariff. So they, just as electricity prices go up every year, the water prices are not cheap. So this is all incentive to be more efficient.
So another question on this side of the room. Was it?
Yes, what type of opportunities do you see for young entrepreneurial Americans to participate in China's rise in the digital economy? Do you see opportunities for us and for our young people to take advantage of that?
Great question. And how should they prepare for it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I believe that this is a global game on technology, and I guess one has to go down to the specific industry. Like healthcare would be an obvious one, where there's so much opportunity, and there's so much demand in China for anything that will improve the quality of healthcare, and whether it's diagnostic or treatment or AI is really good, for example, at reminding you to take your medicine. And so preventive care. I mean, these are things that you can just go into the marketplace right away and find an opportunity. Now, what do you need to prepare? I first of all think China is a full body experience, so there's no way to really understand it without being there. And so the number one thing is to go there, and then preferably speak some of the language, which would really help. So I encourage people who have made a lot of money in the United States to make sure that their children are learning Mandarin, so that they can take advantage of this, and the next generation will continue that track record of entrepreneurial success that the previous generation had. And then after that, again, it is a lot about reciprocity. So you don't want to do business with someone who's not going to treat you well, and vice versa. And so I would try to find partners that can actually effectively be part of one same U.S.-China conversation. So if I go to the Valley now, There's like a third of the valley that gets it, and 2/3 of it that just doesn't want to talk about China. And they say, well, fine, okay, then the third will do business, and 2/3 won't, and 2/3 will go home, and that's okay.
So I have time for one, maybe two more questions. This gentleman up here.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I have a question based upon the essence of comparative advantage. I would suggest that we are witnessing an unprecedented event in the history of the world. On the one hand, our country is a small, it's a noble experiment of 250 years. Its comparative advantage is based upon the work of this fine gentleman. We are an alloy of diversity that fuses together for more creation, more entrepreneurship, more education, and future productivity. On the other hand, I would say we have a new dynastic reality that's controlled by the Communist Party based upon meritocracy. What is the essence of the Chinese comparative advantage, and how can we learn from that?
Wow. Well, great question.
You can answer that in about 68 seconds. Yeah, you got that. You got that.
Yeah. Again, I hate to compare because we lose the best of the both. But the essence, I think, of the Chinese advantage at this moment would be the momentum that it has created to allow the native animal spirits of the Chinese entrepreneur to come to the fore in a socially at least acceptable, if not inclusive fashion. So, I think that they're conscious of their obligations to society, and so it's not entirely robber baron capitalism. But that said, it's all about this entrepreneurship. China's witnessed the single greatest explosion of entrepreneurial energy in the history of mankind. Hundreds of millions of people starting their own businesses. It's just, and that's a unique moment. It is not something we can compare because there is no other place on this planet that has 1.3 billion people who are going through this urbanization transition, and so that is, I think, the essence of it. Now, how can we learn from that? Again, the main thing I think is to recognize that China's structures are fit for purpose, and when the purpose changes, so do the structures. I've been told that it's impossible to change the United States Constitution. The Chinese Constitution changes quite frequently, and on a relative time scale, this is a country that is comfortable rethinking its institutions to ensure that they actually serve the purposes that they were originally intended to. And I think that, for me, would be the single biggest lesson.
So we have another microphone over here.
Hi, very nice presentation. I have a question about digital payments, an area that China is actually very far ahead of the rest of the world. I think their mobile payments is something around 2 orders of magnitude higher than the US. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what are some of the implications of this advantage, and also what the rest of the world can do to catch up.
Yeah, actually it's 11x mobile payments, China versus US. And I think that it's a good question for the credit card companies. It's like, so why are you guys still charging X%? So essentially the first thing is it's a cost advantage. So it just lowers the transaction costs. I'm not a finance guy, but I've been given to understand again it's like 30 or 40% cost advantage to use the mobile payment QR code-based systems than to go through the traditional credit card and processing process. And then I think that is an implication. Then of course mobile payments become much more flexible. So you can do it any place at any time, and you can do it online from your phone, and things can be delivered. So again, it just increases productivity, and it certainly increases consumption. So it's a boost. The other implication is it's not only a cost structure reduction, it's also an increase in revenue, and so it sort of accelerates the whole consumer economy, which is a good thing from a macroeconomy perspective. And finally, there's the information value. So if you do mobile payments, then you're basically you're much easier to tag. And so again, back to this privacy issue, but it certainly does accelerate the marketing capacity in the market. The marketers have more data to work with. And as Robert Mercer says, I think something the only bad data is no data. So so all of that, to take advantage of it, I think we should just ask ourselves, why aren't we doing that? Why haven't we sort of adopted mobile payments? And what is actually the barrier in the credit process? And I will leave that to smarter finance people than me to answer. So.
We are out of time, but this has been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.